Hi, my name is Grace, and in today's Art Matters, we will be discussing A Man in Armour by Rembrandt. Now, this painting is one of Rembrandt's most notable works, but also one of his most controversial due to the amount of scholarly conversation about the ambiguity of this painting. When analysing this work, it is important to remember that this was painted in 1655 by Rembrandt, who is a Dutch painter. During the Dutch Golden Age, we see a lot of mass production in art in terms of getting art to the middle classes, and during this time it was very common for a painting not to have a name and be painted on board. So when looking at analysis, titles would be added retroactively, which could shift how you view the painting and could move you away from artist intent. So, that's just something to keep in mind. In a similar fashion, A Man in Armour is a title that has been added after, and there is a lot of debate about who this man is, and this is definitely something we'll get into later. Now, when you first approach this painting, it has a very sombre feel. There are many factors that bring you to this conclusion. One of the most obvious would be the dark tones and shadows that bleed into the soldier, and even the setting, suggestions of stone arches created by not so much as a deeper tone but a richer tone. This leads you to a lot of questions of time, place, intention of the soldier. What is his expression? What is he carrying? What is he wearing? Who is he? This painting is one full of oxymorons and ambiguity. One of the first I'd like to highlight is a focal point for Rembrandt, and we see this intention through the almost taboo use of pure white on the pearl earring in the centre of the frame. The slither of light that falls centrally whilst the pearl remains slightly off-centre feels almost out of place. Now, this could be for a few reasons. Firstly, as I've mentioned, the use of pure white, as especially in 1655, the classical opinion of pure white as a colour that lacked depth, and especially in the oil that he's painting, usually there would be an undertone, makes it feel out of place. In the same way that this lavish, stereotypically feminine accessory is worn with the armour and the sword and the cape and the sigil. Now, this feeds into the discussion of who the soldier is. On the one hand, this could be ceremonial armour, as suggested by the display of luxuries. On the other hand, knights, especially medieval, were noblemen and had this wealth at their disposal. Perhaps it's garras, it's something won in war as a bounty. By putting it front and centre, Rembrandt is goading us to ask questions, which we will continue to do the longer you look at this. I have had the privilege of seeing this painting in person in the Kelvin Grove Gallery, and the gallery very cleverly has set a seat in front of it because it is a painting that you could stare at for hours and constantly find new things. A great example of that is the void at the bottom of the painting, and the reason I call this the void is because I think this may be something that is easily overlooked. I definitely did it when viewing this painting. The total darkness over the shields, even more intensely than the background, moves the eye away from it. Upon spotting it, it led me to question, anyway, the soldier's state of mind as the shield is up across his body, actually cutting short the reflection from the slither of light we can assume is coming from above on his armour, suggesting maybe a paranoia or an uncomfortability. In addition, the sword beside that, which seems to be the focus of his attention, is he preparing the sword? What does the sword symbolise? Is the sword his duty? Is the sword his way of protecting himself? Is the sword something that he has done something with? When analysing this painting, I like working around the more obvious points of interest because I feel that way you actually contextually learn more about the painting and the person in it. So by the time you do reach the man in armour himself, you have a partially formed opinion of him, which can help you enjoy the painting even more. I know certainly when I'm analysing paintings, looking at the small details and the choices of colour or composition is something that's really exciting to me. Now, I have loosely mentioned the sword, and I think that does not do it justice, and I will definitely come back to it. But for the purposes of the void, as I've been calling it quite dramatically, the intersection of the two suggests perhaps he's unsheathing it, moving with it. The off-centre nature of this sword shows a darkness in the future. Maybe this is metaphorically or also literally, as the darkness he embarks on. We see this in a lot of paintings of night where the main subject is clearly going into and perhaps coming out of a dark scene, in that case more figuratively than here. But I think it's important to see these patterns to try and grasp the purpose of this painting. Another large mass, if you like, is the dark red cape that adorns his shoulder. Whilst this could lead into a ceremonial reading of this piece, I personally am really drawn to the red cape for its vibrancy of colour in an otherwise quite devoid painting. That's not to say there's not depth, but the red definitely catches your eye. And red, of course, can inform a lot of feelings and convey a lot of different meanings. The blood red of battle, the red of fire, the red of violence. I viewed it as a red of protection and of pride, along with the unclear sigil at the bottom. It was almost Arthurian in the nobility of it, in my interpretation anyway. But I definitely think that's something to think about when you're viewing a painting, is acknowledging your first impression, but then also thinking about other people and how they could see the same piece. I think that's the great thing about art, is the subjectivity. So far we've looked at the ambiguous background, the striking focal point that leads to more questions than it answers, and the use of large shapes in the bottom of the painting that tell different stories. And I think the things that tie this together are centrally in the expression of the man in armour. As I've mentioned before, and I'm sure you can see for yourself, the slither of light is a very interesting dramatic tool and really raises the tension of the piece. Another thing it does practically is cover the eyes of the man in shadow. Eyes are a huge part of expression, and so without seeing that, there's another level of ambiguity that really sells the piece, and I think is one of the reasons it's so popular. I mean, Rembrandt's attention to detail and portraiture is one of the main things he's known for, and I think his just skill level really shows in this. I mean, the clench of the jaw, the pursing of the lips, the downturned head. I see that face and I see a sense of divided duty, a resolve. When discussing it, people have suggested a sorrow, a grief, which is, so often portrayed by darkness over the eyes. The direct line of sight between the hilt of the sword and the tip of the helmet really make it clear that the gloved hand gripping the sword is what is drawing his attention in this way. With that in mind, I follow the train of thought of divided duty, of almost a fear through the shield being up in this dark place with only the slither of light, as if he's about to embark on something that, who knows, maybe he won't come back from. And again, the composition, having the man slightly off-centre and showing the sword for almost that entire section, really reinstates its importance. And it's one of the reasons that I think the shield is often overlooked when you glance at the painting. Now moving on to his armour. When looking at this sort of final main section, if you like, I would consider the pearl earring a part of this, for the reasons that I think, whilst being the most obvious display of luxury on him, I think it is important to include the pearl earring, because I think it tells as much of a story as the ruffle of the tie at his neck, or the ornate owl eyes at the front of his plumed helmet. The sword belt, again the cape, the shining armour, the difference in tone that suggests perhaps the helmet contains some gold, again showing a wealth, as does the brooch just beyond the bow, as well as the brooch that lies just below the tie. All of these point to a wealthy or a successful knight. And really, the more you look at this painting, the more questions about the motivations, the backstory, the station of this man come into question. I think maybe that is one of the reasons this painting has been retroactively called a man in armour rather than a knight in armour, because, simply put, it's not obviously apparent. I think that's one of the best things about this painting, is the fact that so much can be inferred, and it's almost a personal exploration and interpretation, which I think is a real skill, to create a piece in the way that you want to create it, whilst also leaving that personal element which helps people connect to artworks and portraits in a way that perhaps a commissioned piece of a noble from the same time wouldn't. Now, I've talked a lot about what the man has on, what he may be thinking, but as I said in the beginning, the most famous question that has come from looking at this painting is, who is the man in armour? Now, there are two main schools of thought. You don't have to agree, but over the years, the two main contenders have been the mythical Greek hero Achilles and the real-life Alexander the Great, who consequently was a huge fan of the character of Achilles and even visited supposed artefacts of the hero. And so both guesses, whichever side of the fence you fall on, do definitely link to each other because of simply the information that is in front of us. I'll lead you first to the helmet. The unusual shape, especially at the top, is very Greek style, or at least a very classical one, as well as the owl eyes at the front. Now, the owl is the iconography of the Greek goddess Athena, of war and wisdom, and this was almost a patron goddess of Achilles and often signifies a Homeric hero. This is definitely an iconography that could have been taken up by Alexander the Great, but this is a main source that suggests that this is supposedly a depiction of Achilles. Another thing that supports this is the sense of divided duty I was discussing before. Achilles famously has a choice to not fight in the Trojan War and die without glory but live a long life, or go and fight in the Trojan War. He will die, but he will have all the glory and all of the notoriety that Greek heroes really wanted. So the sword would hold a lot of weight for him. Another factor that appeals to the school of thought that this is Alexander the Great is the shield and cape, not necessarily what Achilles is depicted wearing. For example, Achilles has a shield made by Hephaestus, which is this huge symbolic piece, intricate. It's got depictions of all aspects of life, weddings, grape pickings, the sun, the sky, the seas. Now, there is an argument that simply because of the shadow this can't be seen, but this also could point to a much more mortal hero. I think on purpose Rembrandt made that sigil so vague, and I think it really adds to the piece. It's definitely not something you notice on first inspection. Again, the ambiguity makes the piece so enticing, and the lack of light apart from on the subject's face makes the piece almost all-encompassing, a tense, sombre atmosphere that draws you into this very small painting. Visually, I think the composition is very clever. The academic conversation around it is so interesting and can be explained so much better by people with degrees than me, but if you want to look into that in your free time, I would definitely recommend it. So that's looking at the main aspects of A Man in Armour by Rembrandt. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for listening, and yeah.